Okay, so hi, my name's Pat Norman and I'm a PhD student in the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. And I've roped in my flatmate, Waylon, here.
Hello, friend.
Who is going to help me explain what is a research paradigm. So a few of my students in EDA 4044, which is a course that we run at the University of Sydney, have already seen this, but this is like a refresher video for them. And I'm using Way as someone that I can explain this to on the way through.
This should be fun.
I'm going to cut that out. I don't want you to sound unenthusiastic.
Why not?
Just because. You should be interested in what I'm explaining. So the basic way we think about the different types of evidence that people collect during a research project is quantitative and qualitative. And most people out there are probably familiar with this, and you're probably familiar with this way.
Yep.
This is the idea of quantitative data is numbers-oriented data, things like surveys, statistics, things that are generalizable. So you would hope that if you're conducting surveys or gathering statistics, they apply in many contexts, not just one. And quite often with quantitative research, they want those results to be replicable, which means that if they ran the same survey or the same set of tests or the same experiment or whatever, you would end up with the same results. Qualitative data, on the other hand, is language-oriented data. It tends to be like interviews, experience. It positions knowledge as a contextual thing, not a general thing. So the kind of information that you find with qualitative data helps to explain why something is happening, whereas quantitative data will explain that something is happening. So they both have their uses in different ways. Oh God. Why the fucking animations? In a previous tutorial, my class we split down the middle of the room these two extremes of a spectrum of how we sort of understand the world and knowledge. And this is a dichotomy. It's not actually like this. The picture is far more complicated, which we're about to see. On one end of that spectrum is positivism, which is the idea that there are absolute truths out there for humans to discover, that facts are objective, and it's important for research to be generalizable, like we mentioned a second ago with the quantitative data, that it can be replicable. And this is basically the scientific way of understanding the world. We run experiments, we theorize, we use maths, we build theories about the world, and we test them to see that they're true. And we can know that they are true. At the extreme other end of the spectrum is this idea of interpretivism, and that's that the truth is context dependent. So what constitutes truth is, based in a particular environment. It's socially constructed and facts are subjective. So at the interpretivist end of the spectrum, we might think that it's important for research to seek understanding of context and experience. So you can see it kind of reflects that quantitative-qualitative divide, even though technically you could probably use both forms of evidence in both types of research, depending how you used it. So I think this is why when you hear sometimes in discussion about American politics at the moment, I think it was Kellyanne Conway, Donald Trump's sort of political advisor, was like, I can't remember what it was, like people have their own facts. What was it?
I remember that.
She said something where it was like, I can't remember. It was like new truth or...
Yeah.
Fuck. I'll put the video.
Yeah, it was something like that people can make up their own facts and will know.
Yeah, we don't accept those facts or something like that.
Right.
So at one end of this, I guess in this interpretivist frame of mind, there's kind of a truth to that truths are actually context dependent, and how you interpret and understand facts is a big part of that. Whereas at the positivist end of the spectrum, it's like, no, there are absolute truths out there. There are things that we know absolutely that sort of ground our experience of reality and that are objective, and you can't argue that.
So positivism is black and whites, whereas interpretivism is greys.
Maybe, except that an interpretivist might be like, well, how you perceive a grey is different to how I perceive a grey.
Right.
Where a positivist would be like, well, black and white are, particular tones. Here is the way we measure those tones. Rah.
Okay, right. Yeah.
So the way we complicate this when we're talking about research paradigms is actually to take those two and expand that spectrum, right? Because it is a spectrum. People don't just sit on one polar extreme or the other. As much as sometimes you see that in public debates about like philosophy and research, and I guess there's this really undergraduate way of approaching it that once people first start to get into this kind of thing, they really get into it and take a position and back it in. Like, you know, the socialists are sort of back in a critical theory approach. You might hear some people like gender studies or that sort of stuff might really lock into a post-structural thing and describe positivist ways of approaching knowledge as imperial or whatever, and positivists will be super dismissive of any other point of view, right? And there'll be some examples in here that might sort of that might seem familiar. So the basic questions that any research paradigm need to answer is the question of ontology, which is the nature of being, the question of epistemology, which is how do we know what we know, and the question of axiology, which is what gives things value and what do we value. So this is basically how they chunk up the idea of ontology. The positivists will say reality is out there. There's some material substrate that is absolute, that we can discover and we can measure it. The harder we work at it. And eventually we can sort of perfect our measures of the universe and we will be able to understand everything perfectly. So a positivist is like reality is out there, separate to us. The table that you see over there in the corner is a real thing, objectively a table. And post-positivists will say, yeah, reality is out there. And so it's very, very similar. Like all the posts are just extensions of the base version of it. But a post-positivist will be like, yeah, reality is out there, but there are limits to a human's ability to accurately capture it and understand it and comprehend it. And it may be that we won't actually understand it perfectly. And it's also that our ways of measuring things are flawed. So a positivist will be like, no, we'll just improve the way of measuring things and one day we will get to the point where we can perfectly understand it. A post-positivist is like, well, we probably won't ever get perfect instruments to fully understand things.
So it's definitely a table, but there is a possibility it may be more than a table.
Well, I mean, the table's probably a bad example, and philosophers always go for these sort of anodyne examples like a coffee cup or a table. A better example might be if our brain, like this is a quote from The Solitaire Mystery, I suspect, if our brains were simple enough for understand it, we'd be so stupid that we couldn't understand it at all. And I think that's kind of the post-positivist thing where it's like the universe is so complicated that as creatures within it, for us to understand it, we would have to sort of transcend the universe.
Right.
It's kind of that acknowledgement there. But there's also other things that go with post-positivism, with epistemology, which I'll get to in a second. Constructivism is where we start to get down to this more social end of the spectrum. So if positivism and post-positivism are like the hard natural sciences, constructivism and onwards is where we get into social sciences. So a constructivist perspective is basically that reality is made by people in social ways. So we construct an understanding of reality around us. You and I both acknowledge that that is a table. That social construct of a table makes sense. It's a product of mutual understanding between us.
Right.
If we both stepped out of the room, a constructivist will be like, or if neither of us existed here, but that structure was still there, it wouldn't be a table. Because no one's here to describe it as a table.
Right.
If that thing grew, if a tree grew exactly in the shape of that table in a forest, it would, you know what I mean? Like it's just a form of life given no meaning because there's no social context sitting around it to produce that.
Right, gotcha.
So reality, like the ontology of a constructivist perspective is like what is given structure within a symbolic framework by human cultures and groups. A critical theorist is like an extension of that, but they read into it power relations. So this all comes from Marxian traditions. And what the ontology of a critical theorist is basically the tension that exists between different social groups and what is produced in those sorts of power relations. So what, you know, you'd still see a table, I guess, but there might be an understanding that there are relations of production that led to the creation of that table. I mean, that's an IKEA table. So let's think about like how rich Sweden is or something, but then also it may have been produced in God knows what country where someone was being paid, you know, tragic amounts of, like they were getting the slave labor or like a incredibly poor wage. But at the same time, there's also, deforestation going on somewhere to produce the wood that goes into that table.
Right.
Blah, blah, blah. So a critical theorist reads things through the lens of social relations and power relations in particular. And then the post-structural theorist down the other end, and I should say it's not just post-structuralism, it could be postmodernism, interpretivism. Whatever you see down that end of that paradigm spectrum is a choice made by the person putting together a presentation about it. So I've gone post-structuralism,
right.
but, and they do mean different things, but I had to sort of draw a line somewhere, and I'm more comfortable talking about post-structuralism.
Yeah.
So that's that reality is a super contextual attempt to ascribe meaning to something meaningless. So it's like the idea of a table is something produced in language and in discourse at a given moment. So the ontology of post-structuralism exists entirely within language. This is what I think it was Jean-François Lyotard, I think, might have been the one to say, or it could be Jacques Derrida. So it's one of these French postmodernists, said there is nothing outside the text. And by that he meant outside of meaning and outside of this textual meaning that we give the world, there isn't anything meaningful to apprehend. Jacques Lacan, who is a French psychoanalyst back from the 1960s, he kind of inspired Slavoj Žižek. He extended some of the Marxian and Freudian stuff. He has his sort of triad of the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. And so, the imaginary, forget about that, it's this sort of early stage in child development. The symbolic is the order of language that we communicate with, right? And this is probably where post-structuralists situate most of our understanding of the world, within the symbolic register. The real is everything that we can't capture in the symbolic. And the real is kind of what the positivists are like, well, we can actually get at that with the proper tools. And a post-structuralist will basically make the point, well, those tools themselves are already mediated by language. So I'm kind of... Yeah, go.
So a table is a table purely because we call it a table. If we call it a chair, the whole thing changes.
Well, the physical structure is the same thing,
right,
but the way we understand it
is different.
Well, sure. But I guess we'd still be looking at the same physical structure.
Right.
But our understanding of the word table would change.
Right.
And that's kind of what post-structuralism, postmodernism likes to grapple with. If I say to you, der Tisch, that's sort of a meaningless phrase to you, but in German, that means the table.
Right.
And it's gendered masculine. So there's all this stuff attached to language that doesn't really make... the way you understand that particular word in a different context or different cultural context or between a different person with the sort of personal connotations that might attach to all that stuff. That's the sort of stuff that post-structuralists are interested in. It's in that space that reality is produced.
Right.
So the next question is one of epistemology, which is how do we come to know things? So a positivist, which is kind of like the archetype is the scientist, the cold, disinterested scientist. They see the knower of whatever as distinct from the objective thing that they're trying to know. So they measure and analyze the world. So a positivist would see a table or see the stars or see, a human brain or a body that they were conducting an autopsy on. And they'll be like, I am separate to this thing. And I can analyze it and I'm completely separate to it. A post-positivist recognizes that a researcher is building an approximation of the object of their research. So this kind of goes to how do they understand reality? There's an alignment between those two.
Right.
So they understand, I can get a rough idea. I can do my dissections. Or in medicine, for example, I can experiment with certain medicines and certain effects, but I'm also aware there will be side effects. And I won't fully understand, for example, Panadol, we don't fully understand how paracetamol works in the body. Not fully.
Right.
We know there are very few side effects, and we know that this drug has this sort of inhibiting, pain-blocking effect. But what is going on fully, we don't quite understand. So we have an approximation of knowledge, not a perfect understanding. A constructivist understands knowledge as co-constructed. So we build knowledge, and they actually see the researcher as a part of that process of knowledge building.
Right.
So a researcher is not separate anymore. They're a part of the process. Which is why we also talk about, in education, we talk about constructivism quite a bit as a particular model. We know that people build knowledge socially. We've had this, 100 or 150 years of educational psychology and research from a whole bunch of big names, like Jean Piaget was an American. Sorry, not American. John Dewey was an American. Jean Piaget. Lev Vygotsky, all these sort of old guys over the past 100 years who sort of set up the idea of education as a constructivist or constructionist discipline, that we build knowledge together because knowledge is a social phenomenon.
Right.
So a constructivist would understand that the researcher is a part of the thing that they're researching, that they change it by being involved in it. Critical theorists are another step along again. They're basically like a researcher must make a change, and they must change things for the better. So the disciplines they'll kind of listed here is like some sociology, some politics, but this comes from Karl Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. I think it was his 10th thesis, where he's basically saying that so far philosophy has interpreted the world and tried to understand it, but the job of a sociologist, of a philosopher, is to change it.
Right.
So he was making the point that it's not enough to just sort of know and learn and understand the world. Knowledge is political because it's based on these power structures. And the job of a researcher is to intervene deliberately to change things. So a constructivist recognizes that things are going to change. A critical theorist is like, we must change them for the better.
Right.
Standpoint becomes really important for a constructivist. And then for a post-structuralist, they think that knowledge, or what we understand as knowledge, is contextual and unstable. So we can sort of trace its representations. And even though he's hard to place on these sorts of things, I think Foucault is a really good example of how you might think in post-structuralist terms. The idea of sexuality is only, 200 odd years old, or homosexuality is only 200 odd years old. If you go back a couple of thousand years, they don't have an idea like that or a concept like that. It hasn't been produced yet. That discourse in language that now comes to structure so many people's lives in all these interesting ways doesn't exist yet.
So that'd be your labeling theory.
Labeling theory? I don't know what you're talking about.
Do you, actually?
No, I'm not familiar with what you're saying.
So the way that we label someone, say youth, we label them in a certain way, and then because we label them as that, they start to react to that label. Absolutely,
yes.
And then they actually become the label, but they wouldn't have become the label until we'd actually labeled them.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that we talk about, like deficit models of understanding students in the classroom. When we sort of come in and talk to a student like, oh, well, you're the naughty kid, they internalize that.
Right, and they become the naughty kid.
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
they're like, see, I told you they were the naughty kid. You were the naughty kid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is all about how discourses come to trap people and produce certain behaviors.
Right.
So then the next thing is the idea of axiology, which is like, where does value come from, or how do we produce value? And what I thought was easier to think about here was archetypes of characters from science fiction and how they sort of display these values. And I know you're not a huge sci-fi fan.
No, I know them.
So at the extreme positivist end of the spectrum, you would have Spock, a Vulcan, and the Vulcan species in Star Trek. They're logical. Logic is the core of everything. They have no emotion. They're disengaged from things, and their understanding is like logic is this fundamental absolute to the way of understanding the world.
Sheldon Cooper.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I ask my students, like, come up with TV shows you want to hear from, and they're like Big Bang Theory, and you can think of that as the like archetype of the nerdy person who just goes, I don't understand, like, I need a logical answer to this. Yeah. There has to be an absolute logical solution to this. The next step along from that is post-positivism, and here it gets a bit murky because I think Jean-Luc Picard actually falls into the constructivist end of things as well, because he's a diplomat, not just a scientist. But like Star Trek as a TV series and as a set of movies is sort of firmly set within this sciencey, this belief in the Enlightenment, right? Enlightenment values of, the more we research, the more we get to know, the better we'll make society. And it's super optimistic, and it's a really lovely thing. And the Enlightenment was an incredibly optimistic time. I want to sort of preface this by saying I'm not taking sides in this thing. I'll talk later about, or in another video about paradigm wars, because people get into these wars. Jordan Peterson is a classic for coming from this sort of positivist frame of mind and throwing critique at post-structuralist and critical theorists.
And lobsters.
Yeah. But, so with post-positivists, there's a move from logic, cold, hard logic, to reason, which is not as cold and calculating. There's still a more human element to it, a recognition that there are limits to it, maybe. It's dispassionate rather than disengaged. So it's still, works with things and understand its place in things and the imperfections of it, but tries to stay calm.
Right.
I guess, bad word to use, and it's also got the idea that the knowledge it produces is universal. So where one is absolute knowledge, like it's the same wherever it goes, the values that, the Federation express, they try to express as, they recognize that some of the competing races in the galaxy don't have the same values, but they try and express universal values about the rights of living creatures or whatever. Next along, we've got constructivists. And this is actually a really hard one to pick because, again, Yoda, tricky. But I think because the Jedi sort of have this kind of reasonable, logical approach, but Yoda also gets the importance of context. There's a scene in The Empire Strikes Back, the first one that he's in, where Luke's like, I don't believe it, and he doesn't believe in the Force or whatever. And Yoda says to him,
its energy surrounds us and binds us. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter.
And I think what I like about that is that it's Yoda recognizing there is more to us than just the material substrate of reality. That's not to say a positivist and post-positivist perspective can't be applied to human behavior, but I think the constructivist thing sort of explicitly recognizes that. So Yoda comes from a place of rationality. Rationality is mediated by power and by human relations, whereas reason and logic tend to be, or ideally, sort of disconnected from that, even though critical theorists and post-structuralists argue it is not. And it's contextual. Yoda gets the importance of context. It changes knowledge changes its value and its sense of value in different contexts. Critical theorists, I've got Leia there because she sort of leads the rebellion and the resistance in the Star Wars films. And that's this idea that it's not just about learning things, but it's about critiquing social structures and bringing about socially just transformations. So she wants to overthrow the Empire because it's racist, it's oppressive, it's all that sort of stuff. And she comes from, that tradition of theorists comes from, say, Karl Marx, who was looking out for the rights of working class people who were being, mistreated and abused and exploited in factories because it was on the Industrial Revolution was happening and people were being treated like crap. So that tradition sort of flowed on through a whole lot of theorists through the Frankfurt School in the early 20th century as well. And this mob basically were a whole lot of theorists who were theorizing about totalitarianism and how did Nazi Germany come about and all this sort of stuff. They're not the only people that critique it. Like, critical theorists evolved in the 20th century to also include civil rights movements. So the sort of Martin Luther King and Black Power movements and stuff like that in the 1960s. Feminism, gay liberation movements, and queer theory sort of evolved out of that. Queer theory now is sort of really heavily articulated in post-structural terms. So it's really heavily aligned with people like Judith Butler and that crowd. And that's sort of a post-structural, and this is why it's sort of hard to lump it all together, because you don't want to put Judith Butler and Foucault in the same space as a phrase like deconstruction, which is Jacques Derrida. And that's the idea that you just pull apart these grand narratives. And by grand narratives, I might mean something like Star Trek or Star Wars, which are big grand narratives.
Right.
Capitalism, big grand narrative. The class struggle, big grand narrative. What Foucault argued is that these grand narratives are actually products of discourse and they sort of come together for a time and then they'll disappear and evolve into something else. Judith Butler would argue that some of these ideas like sexuality or gender are performative things that we act out a certain role for ourselves.
Right.
So it's got a discursive function. It creates our identity. And Jacques Derrida was basically all about just pulling apart those narratives completely. I think Futurama and Dr. Zoidberg fit into that really nicely because it's just a satire. It turns the conventions of science fiction on its head. It creates this very amoral world, this almost nihilistic world in Futurama, where it's mad. And it's chaotic, and it's a commentary on the grand narratives of Star Trek and Star Wars. It just completely pulls it apart.
Right.
This experiment will determine what food, if any, the alien eats.
A buffet? Oh, if only I had my wallet with me.
It's free.
So pop culture and these paradigms to sort of weave in a Marvel Cinematic Universe thing, which may not make much sense to you. From the positivist thing, I positioned like Tony Stark in the first Iron Man film because he's an engineer, and he sort of says, "Oh, I can solve any problem." In Avengers Endgame, he's like, "I can crack time travel if I'm given enough time."
Right.
I'll let you move around before I.
Thanks.
And I think Thanos sort of fits into the positivist thing because Thanos is like, well, if I get my Infinity Gauntlet, the perfect tool, I'll be able to solve this problem of overpopulation of the universe by snapping my fingers and wiping out half of all life. So he's got an absolute solution, one that applies everywhere he goes. He's logical about it. He's completely disengaged, unemotional about it. This is how he's going to solve this problem.
Right.
Bad solution because in 62 years, the universe would have repopulated the half you just wiped out. Didn't logic that right through. I think Tony Stark starts to make a journey. So I think the first three Iron Man films take him on a journey from a extreme positivist to a constructivist. But I've got Avengers: Age of Ultron and Iron Man 2 in this post-positivist thing because there is this tension between Captain America, who's sort of like, oh, we don't want our crazy technology. We need to understand the limitations of our technology. Versus Tony Stark, who's sort of pressing it, saying, no, we need to protect the Earth. I need to build a shield around the world and all this sort of stuff. But they both come from this place of like kind of dispassionate reason and universal values. I mean, Cap, everyone's sort of, Cap, isn't he like... He's not a critical theorist. He's this representation of America at its best, i.e. America around World War II, when America was, a reasonably unambiguously good nation, although I mean, like, how you can say unambiguously for any country. So I would never position Cap in that place. To get to the constructivist end of it, like by Iron Man 3, Tony Stark understands that he's more in love with Pepper Potts. He's looking out for this little kid. The suit of armor and the engineering solutions aren't everything anymore. He now needs human solutions to a lot of his problems. So he starts to understand the importance of contextual knowledge and how that operates in certain environments. And Captain Marvel sort of understands that her identity is structured by her social environments. So at the start of the film, she thinks that she's a Kree warrior. By the end of the film, she realizes that she's a human, that she was raised here, and that her social environment contributes to her understanding of herself and her social role.
Right.
The easiest to pick of the Marvel films here is the critical theory, because Thor Ragnarok is a post-colonial film. Taika Waititi directs it. It brings this super awareness of colonialism to bear. At the start of the film, they're using Immigrant Song, which is in itself a kind of commentary on what's happening around the world at the moment and sort of flows of people. At the end of the film, they bring Immigrant Song back. It's got these sort of Viking themes to it, so it's this perfect song. But you end the film with Asgard being blown up, and there's this diaspora of the Asgardian people. They're stuck on this refugee ship, this boat in space. But also, at the start of the film or halfway through the film, Cate Blanchett's character is sort of staring up at this mural on the roof of Valhalla and saying basically, didn't you know that we were this imperial race, that we went out and conquered the whole galaxy and forced them to bow before us, and now we pretend that we're civilized? And it's just so much a commentary on it. And then Black Panther is kind of this like inversion where it's saying actually the most advanced city and group of this ethnic grouping on the planet is actually the Wakandans, a bunch of Africans. Like, it's in the middle of the African continent. They've got the most advanced technology in the whole world. And it's kind of like this inversion of expectations where, slaves were just ripped out of Africa by Europeans. Even now, like, Africa is one of the most impoverished countries in the world, and it's kept that way by the West. So Black Panther just flips that on its head. And then the last one, which I thought is like post-structural, is Guardians of the Galaxy, because it just takes the piss out of itself. Probably a more accurate film to say is a post-structural film is the Ryan Reynolds one, Deadpool. Because he literally talks down the camera to you. He just subverts what it is to be a film in the first place.
Right.
So post-structural is not just weird. It's commentary on the fact that it is a text.
Right.
So the other films all sort of exist in an isolated universe, like as though it was a real story. There's no recognition that it's an MCU film, but Guardians of the Galaxy tends to do that a bit more. It's more.
Deadpool does it a lot.
Yeah, Deadpool does it a lot. Deadpool is just explicitly a post-structural film. It comments on the fact that is a text. It breaks the fourth wall, fifth wall, whatever. So the reason it's important for researchers to know about this stuff is because there should ideally be alignment, right? If you think that there are absolute truths to the universe, then you can't really take a post-structural perspective on the things that you're researching. And also, if you've got an ontology that's sort of, even the research approach that you take produces a particular kind of ontology. So for my PhD, I'm using institutional ethnography and I'm looking at schools. By doing that, I'm actually drawing a line around what I say is real and what is not. I basically say the world, the reality with which I'm grappling is the sort of social lived experience of a teacher in a particular environment. That necessarily sort of, it's not that it says that the physical reality doesn't exist. It just truncates the stuff that I'm interested in observing. So I produce, this is what Kevin Wolby calls a truncated ontology. So my sense of reality is abbreviated. It's kept within a certain boundary. And then my epistemology, my way of understanding how that, how I can interrogate that, sits up that constructivist, critical, post-structuralist end of the spectrum. It could be critical if I sort of wanted to read into it certain social justice values, or I could just sort of go, I'm interested in the textual reality of that place, or I'm interested in how people produce a certain social reality. And that sort of bleeds into the research methods that I would use, and so on. I'm going to show that. Lincoln and Gruber kind of did the classic text in this field. So I'm just going to sort of put this on the screen. If people want to pause the YouTube video, they can do that. They can look at this and have a read through. This is just some of the practical research issues that people encounter. Things like ethics, the voice, like whose voice is coming through in this, in the research. One of the things that's really important with education research is that you get voices of either practitioners, in my case, or like school students if you're talking to them. So whose voice is coming through in the research is something that's really heavily informed by your research paradigm. If you are a positivist, like maybe it doesn't matter whose voice is coming through in the research. It should though. But they'll be thinking, we want this sort of disinterested, disengaged scientist to be the person to do the speaking. Whereas a critical theorist would be like, well, we want to take the standpoint of someone who's actually suffering or oppressed or disempowered by this system.
Right.
So the next slide is just a bit of a summary of these research paradigms. This is drawn from J. Amos Hatch's book. So again, you can just pause that screen and have a look through there. That's just a neat summary of everything that just happened. The ontology, the epistemology, particularly methodology, so the way that people might inquire into these, into a particular phenomenon that they're interested in, and the products of that. So a positivist will produce facts and theories and laws, whereas a constructivist might find more case studies or narratives, and post-structuralists will create things like genealogies, which is what Foucault did. And I think this is one of the interesting reasons why, and I'll have another video put up on YouTube later about that, where I'll talk about a couple of researchers that I think really draw these issues out, one of whom is Jordan Peterson, because he sort of describes absolute truths, facts and theories and laws. You know, I don't want to go into it too much here, but he'll basically say things like, here's why people behave the way they behave, because we're like related to lobsters or apes or whatever the fuck it is. Right. So he's got these sort of theories about the world, and he's like, that's the absolute truth of it, the biology of human psychology. Whereas a post-structuralist, and these people that he doesn't like, might be like, well, the meaning of our social structures and the things that we do is a little bit more elaborate than that. So maybe you're missing a part of the picture there.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that people are wrong to take a different paradigm. It just means that
different way of looking at it.
Exactly. Paradigms have different ways of looking at the world. That's it. I reckon that'll do for today. Yeah. Are you content to do this again one time?
Sure.
It's fun, hey.
That's actually made it a fuckload clearer.